Hi everyone. Okay, I thought I would try and start a few very quick tutorials for people who are struggling with the whole idea of dry brush. There are a number of different techniques that we can use in watercolor painting, but it seems that for whatever reason, people have difficulty understanding the concept of what dry brush is all about. It's a technique I use fairly regularly. It's part of my sort of kit of tools that I use when I go out plein air painting, and it's a really good and effective way of creating a sense of detail without actually painting a lot of detail. We sort of get away with doing, well, not so much get away, but we often use the technique of wet on wet for elements and objects in the distance. But when it comes to things where you're not quite sure how to paint, but you need to give some impression, then dry brush is very much the way you're sort of going to work those forms. So I suppose what it comes down to, in essence, are some basic things we need to have or need to understand. Dry brush effectively works on the principle that you're not using a lot of water, and you're using it in a very sparing way, and working it onto the page, onto your paper, with any number of brushes. But in essence, you're sort of working with a starved pigment, starved wetness of the brush onto a dry surface. In order to get this sort of graininess of a stroke or of an object on the page. Ideally, for that, you need to work with rough textured paper. It can be anything from a 185 GSM to 300 GSM. I'm using 300 GSM paper here. It's rough Saunders Waterford. Pretty average, pretty typical sort of paper. I've painted on the other side, so I'm happy to use this side as a bit of a trial run to run this. In essence, I'll sort of show you some of the basic techniques. I mean, this is my palette with my colours. I'm not going to get too technical. I might probably best just show you onto the paper, on paper, how I achieve working dry brush, so you can then practice and see how you go. We can pick any number of colors, it doesn't matter, probably a darker color so that you can actually see what we're going to be doing on the paper. But as you can see, the brushes that I'm using, and there are a number of them, these just so happen to be mops. What are they? Masters Mops by Neef. Neef is a nice Australian brand of brushes. And as you can see, these are sort of a mix, synthetic squirrel mix. Mops, very large bulbous heads, nice points. And the good thing about a mix, whether it's a natural fibered squirrel or a sable, in this particular case, these brushes are very well. I've found them to be very good because they do have a sort of, in that sense, a lack of memory. If you know what, for better words, memory is that sort of thing, that springiness that you see in synthetic brushes generally. And here's a synthetic brush. If you were to, and this is dry, there's nothing, no paint or water in there, but even if you were to wet the tip, if you were to put your finger on the bristles and spring them, you'll see that they generally spring back into that vertical inline position with the rest of the brush. So that's sort of memory of a brush. With a sable or a synthetic mix, you'll find that when you do the same with that brush, you'll find, and this is slightly wet, there is this tendency to come back, but you'll see that there's not as much. You'll see that there's a tendency for the bristles to stay on an angle. So there's less memory in that sense, and that actually is a key thing to helping you with your dry brush. Ideally, another thing is that ideally depending on how much water and how much pigment, or effectively how damp the brush is, the less damp the brush, the more of that, the graininess you'll see on the paper. But obviously with less pigment, you'll see less colour and less markings at all. So let's just try a little bit to see what I'm sort of rambling on about. Anyway, here we go. So I've dipped, as you can probably see in the shot, there's a little bit of water just to give some sort of level of workability to the colour. I'm picking a burnt sienna, for example, so I'll mix my burnt sienna, and you can sort of get a bit of feel for how much colour I'm picking up, what sort of consistency that is. So in this case, it's a bit of a, you can see it has a tendency to stick around the edges, so that's a nice sort of stickiness. But as you can see, as I try to get rid of the water from the brush, like so, there's not very much on the brush at all. So rather than using the point on the page, which will only promote really a lot of water just flowing down linearly down each of the bristles to the point, like let's just show, like so, which you end up with continuous lines. If we were to use the heel and the side of the brush, you'll find that you end up with, and again, depends on how you hold it. If you hold the brush like this and run it backwards, you'll find that you'll end up with a rough-edged shape, like so. There you go. If you hold it from the side and try to run it from the side, you'll get a similar sort of thing. Obviously, there's not much water or colour on there. Let's just add a little bit more so you get a bit more of an idea. So this is that sticky mix that I was talking to you about. Let's just run horizontally again. So slightly more colour, but you can see the broken nature of that line. If we go the other way, again, you still get that dry brush effect. It all comes down to the speed. If you start adding more water, to your mix. So let's just have a little, just mix it up a little bit more. So if we add a little bit more water, you can see that sort of flowing a little bit more in that in the pan, and we have a little bit more holding in the brush. You now need to move the brush quicker in order to distribute and give you that broken shape again. So if you go slowly like we did before, you'll end up with it still catching and depositing most of the water on there. You'll get some broken edges, but you know, you need to move the brush a lot quicker if you're wanting to achieve a more pigmented stroke, but still effectively dry brush. So I'll show you what I mean. So there's still a fair amount of water there, and you go quicker, and you still end up depositing a fair amount of colour with less of the broken character. And as the brush dries, you'll see. So with that as it dries, I mean as it has less water and less pigment, but we still go with that speed, you'll see it just going to start running out of tone and developing more of a broken edge. So here we go, up the page, you can see same speed, and see how it's drying out. These are the effects that you should probably be practicing in order to get a feel for what your brush can do. Every brush, to a degree, whether it's a chisel, a square-ended brush, a mop configuration like this, they can all brushes can generally do a dry brush effect. You just have to play with them, understand what sort of amount of pigmentation and water, how damp effectively the brushes need to be for them to achieve the sort of results that you're after. So again, I'll just dip into a little bit of water. Here's some water, here's some more paint, so we'll get that into a nice sticky consistency. So in order to achieve that sort of broken nature of dry brush, and again, we can, rather than straight lines, we'll try and something a little bit different. I tend to hold, here's one technique, I tend to hold the brush about here in this sort of configuration, and I like to almost push against the direction that you would normally take a brush, which is in this direction. I tend to push sometimes, and it could be a very nice way of generating a tree form, for example, and I'll just sort of show you what I mean. So, and this is also for clouds and things like that. So, you know, by pushing opposite to the direction that you'd normally go, you can generate some very interesting dry brush effects. Obviously you can use your tip again and help that along and give you some other calligraphy that sort of helps you achieve different sorts of drawn and figurative elements, but otherwise you can sort of skip back to that and away you go. While it's still wet, we can introduce other colours. Let's pick another colour. Let's have a Viridian, for example. So the paint is still wet from the first go. I'm just really now playing, but in terms of dry brush, let's have a look. Going over the top. So that's introducing a green, and you can start mixing all your colours like that. Again, dry brush into dry brush. Here we go, at the top up there. So really, you need to just play with your brush, practice with it, see what it can do. Let's try some fine points. So again, we'll hold it and just run some lines. If you hold this long enough, the paint will run out and you'll start getting some dry brush thin lines, as I'm sort of achieving here. Again, it comes down to the speed. If I go very slowly, you're not going to get that dry brush effect, but as soon as you speed up, you'll start to generate these dry brush strokes. So it's all in the amount of pigment and water there is in the brush, and how quickly and what sort of ability you have to articulate, moving from holding a brush like this to using the point of the brush with its own calligraphy, to the side of the brush where you're now working the sides of the actual sort of what's it called, the knee or the elbow of the brush, the base of the brush, rather than the ends or the tip. So here we go. So that's effectively some very basic principles around dry brush. Obviously, this is only a very quick demonstration in isolation to normally what would otherwise be a painting, and you'll no doubt see once I start doing a few more of these videos, I'll be connecting all the dots for you, showing more separated techniques, and then how I bring them all together in my faster plein air painting exercises. So until then, hope that's given you something to think about, to practice with. By all means, try with all the different brushes you have. I mean, I have a range of these that I like to use purely for not so much purely, but because they are so versatile. Mops will hold a lot of water and give you a lot of versatility for different strokes. Some of which, a main one that I always use here is this dry brush technique. So anyway, hopefully that gives you something.